The rain fell in relentless sheets, each drop a cold accusation against the polished granite of the grave. I stood there, Michael Lancaster, a man who had built an empire from nothing, now reduced to a shadow under a black umbrella. My suit clung to me, heavy with water, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Not when she stood before me, the woman with eyes that burned through the storm, holding a child who looked at me with a gaze that tore my world apart. "This is your daughter," she said, her voice steady but trembling at the edges, like a blade held too tightly. "Her name is Lily." I didn't know her. I swear I didn't. The child, maybe 5 years old, clutched a soaked teddy bear, her dark curls plastered to her face. Those eyes, brown, bright, with a slight curve at the edges, were mine. I'd seen them in the mirror every morning, but never like this, never so small, so vulnerable. My throat tightened, and I tried to speak, but the words drowned in the rain. "You're mistaken," I managed, my voice a hollow echo of the man who commanded boardrooms. "I don't have a daughter." She didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her cheap coat soaked through, her boots sinking into the mud. "You don't remember me, do you, Michael?" Her words weren't a question, they were wound, raw and bleeding. 6 years ago. The pier. The storm. You promised you'd come back. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world stopped, rain, wind, time itself. I saw it then, a flicker of something buried deep, a memory I'd locked away. A woman, a night, a moment I thought meant nothing. But here she was, standing at the grave of someone I'd loved, someone who betrayed me, and she was tearing my life apart with a single sentence. I looked down at the headstone, the name carved in elegant script, Eleanor Lancaster. My wife. My late wife, who died 2 years ago, leaving me with nothing but questions and a hollow penthouse. Eleanor, who'd smiled through her lies, who'd built a life with me while hiding secrets I was only now beginning to unravel. What does this have to do with her? I asked, my voice sharper now, anger rising to mask the fear clawing at my chest. The woman, her name still escaped me, knelt by the grave, her fingers brushing the stone as if it could answer her. "Everything," she whispered. "Eleanor knew about us. She knew about Lily. And she made sure you'd never find out." Her words hit like a fist, each one knocking the air from my lungs. I staggered back, the umbrella slipping from my hand, letting the rain drench me completely. Lily whimpered, clinging to her mother's side, and I felt a pang I couldn't name, not guilt, not yet, but something close, something that made my hands shake. "You're lying," I said, but the words sounded weak, even to me. "Eleanor would never." "Wouldn't she?" she cut in, her voice rising, sharp enough to slice through the storm. "You think you knew her, Michael? You think the woman you loved was honest? She lied to you. She lied to me. And she lied to this child, who's never known her father because of it." Her eyes glistened, not with rain but with tears she refused to let fall. I wanted to argue, to shout, to demand proof, but I couldn't move. The weight of her words pinned me to the spot, and all I could do was stare at the child, my child, whose small hand reached out, brushing my sleeve. "Daddy?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper, but it shattered me. I dropped to my knees, the mud soaking through my trousers, my hands hovering over her tiny shoulders but not daring to touch. I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't even know how to be a man anymore, not here, not now. The woman watched me, her expression unreadable, a mix of pity and defiance. "You don't believe me," she said softly. "But you will. Because I kept something you gave me that night. Something Eleanor tried to take away." She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a small, tarnished locket. It gleamed faintly under the cemetery's dim lights, and my breath caught. I knew that locket. I'd given it to someone long ago, in a moment of reckless hope, a moment I'd buried under years of ambition and grief. "Where did you get that?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. She didn't answer, just pressed it into my hand, the metal cold against my palm. Inside, I knew what I'd find, a tiny photo, a promise, a piece of a life I'd walked away from. "I didn't come here to ruin you," she said, her voice softer now, almost breaking. "I came because Lily deserves to know who her father is. And because I'm tired of carrying this alone." She turned, lifting Lily into her arms, and started to walk away, her figure blurring in the rain. I called after her, but my voice was lost in the storm. "Wait!" I shouted, stumbling forward, the locket clutched in my fist. "What's your name?" She paused, just for a moment, and looked back. "Clara," she said. And then she was gone, swallowed by the mist, leaving me alone with the grave and the weight of a truth I wasn't ready to face. I sank to the ground, the locket burning in my hand, Eleanor's name staring up at me from the stone. "6 years ago," she'd said. 6 years ago, I'd been someone else, someone who believed in love, in promises, in nights that could change everything. But that man was gone, buried under the weight of Lancaster Corp, under the lies Eleanor had spun, under the life I'd chosen instead. I opened the locket. Inside was a photo of a younger me, smiling, my arm around a woman whose face was half hidden by shadow. Clara. It had to be her. And on the other side, a tiny, faded note in my handwriting, asterisk, for the one who makes the stars brighter. Asterisk, I'd written that, drunk on wine and hope, on a pier under a storm that felt like it could wash the world clean. I'd promised to come back. I hadn't. And now, here I was, at the grave of the woman who'd known it all, who'd kept Clara and Lily from me, who'd built a cage of secrets I was only now beginning to see. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Not when every beat of my heart screamed that I'd lost something irreplaceable, something I didn't even know I had. Clara's words echoed in my mind, asterisk, she lied to us both. Asterisk, what had Eleanor done? Why had she hidden this? And why, even now, did the thought of her betrayal hurt less than the sight of Lily's eyes, so much like mine, calling me Dad? I stood, the locket still in my hand, and looked at the grave one last time. "You should have told me," I whispered, though I knew Eleanor couldn't hear. "You should have trusted me." But maybe she hadn't. Maybe she'd seen the man I'd become, cold, driven, untouchable, and decided I didn't deserve to know. I turned away, the cemetery silent except for the drip of rain, and made a vow to myself. I'd find Clara. I'd find Lily. And I'd uncover every lie Eleanor had left behind, even if it tore my world apart. Because 6 years ago, I'd made a promise. And this time, I wouldn't break it. 6 years ago, the world felt softer, less jagged. I was Michael Lancaster, not yet the untouchable CEO, but a man still climbing, still hungry, still capable of being swayed by a storm and a stranger's smile. The pier was alive that night, despite the rain that drove most people indoors. Neon lights flickered through the downpour, painting the wooden slats in hues of red and blue, and the air smelled of salt and fried dough from the carnival stalls that hadn't yet closed. I'd come to escape the boardroom, the deals, the weight of a name I was only beginning to make mean something. I didn't expect to find her. I didn't expect anything at all. She was there, under a sagging awning, her hair wet and clinging to her face, her dress too thin for the chill. She was trying to light a cigarette, her hands shaking as the wind snuffed out every match. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the way she cursed under her breath, a mix of frustration and defiance that made me smile despite myself. "Need a light?" I asked, pulling a lighter from my pocket, a silver one, engraved with my initials, a gift from a father I barely remembered. She looked up, and those eyes hit me like a wave. Not just brown, but alive, like they held stories I'd never earned the right to hear. "Thanks," she said, her voice low, almost lost in the rain. She took the lighter, her fingers brushing mine, cold but steady. The flame caught, and for a moment, we were the only two people in the world, the storm a curtain around us. "You're not from here," she said, exhaling smoke that curled into the night. It wasn't a question. I laughed, leaning against the railing, the wood slick under my palms. What gave me away? The suit. She smirked, glancing at my tailored jacket, already ruined by the rain. The way you walk. Like you own the place. I didn't own anything that night, not the pier, not my future, not even my own heart. We talked, though I can't recall every word. Her name was Clara, she said, and she worked odd jobs, waitressing, cleaning, whatever paid the rent. She'd grown up in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, and she'd come to the city chasing something she couldn't name. Freedom, maybe, she said, her eyes distant. Or just a place where nobody knows me. I told her about my dreams, the company I was building, the legacy I wanted to leave. I didn't tell her about the loneliness, but I think she saw it anyway. The rain didn't let up, and neither did we. We moved to a diner nearby, one of those 24-hour places with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like regret. She ordered pie, cherry, because it was the cheapest, and I paid, waving off her protests. It's just pie, I said, but the way she looked at me, like I'd given her something more, stayed with me. We sat there until the storm eased, sharing stories that felt too big for strangers. She told me about her mother, who'd raised her alone, who'd taught her to find beauty in broken things. I told her about my father, whose only lesson was to never trust anyone. That's a sad way to live, she said softly, and I didn't argue. Somewhere in those hours, I gave her the locket. It was impulsive, stupid even, but it felt right. I'd carried it for years, a relic of a life I'd left behind, and I wanted her to have it. For the one who makes the stars brighter, I said, scribbling the note inside, my handwriting sloppy from too much wine. She laughed, a sound that warmed me more than the diner's weak heater, and slipped it into her pocket. Your trouble, she said, but her eyes said she didn't mind. We walked back to the pier as dawn broke, the sky bruising purple and gold. The carnival was quiet now, the ride still, the air heavy with the promise of something ending. I wanted to kiss her, but I didn't. Instead, I promised I'd find her again. I'll come back, I said, my hand lingering on hers. You better, she replied, her smile half teasing, half hopeful. I watched her walk away, her figure fading into the morning mist, and I told myself I'd keep that promise. But life had other plans. Back in the city, the world closed in. Deals piled up, deadlines loomed, and Eleanor, my fiancée then, filled the spaces Clara had touched. Eleanor was everything Clara wasn't, polished, ambitious, a partner who fit the life I was building. She dazzled me, made me believe we were unstoppable. I didn't forget Clara, not entirely, but I let her slip into the corners of my mind, a memory too fragile for the life I'd chosen. I told myself she was a moment, not a future. I told myself she'd forget me too. But now, standing in that cemetery, her words echoing in my ears, you promised you'd come back, I knew I'd been wrong. Clara hadn't forgotten. She'd carried that night, that locket, that promise, through years I'd spent building walls around my heart. And Lily, God, Lily, was the proof of it, a child born from a moment I dismissed as fleeting. I closed my eyes, the locket still in my hand, and saw Clara's face under that awning, her smile cutting through the rain. I'd been someone else then, someone who believed in stars and second chances. The diner was still there, I learned later, though the booths were faded now, the pie $1 more. I went back once, after Eleanor's death, hoping for what, I don't know. Clara wasn't there, of course, but the waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, remembered her. Sweet girl, she said, wiping the counter. Used to bring her kid in here, always asking for cherry pie. My heart stopped. Kid? I asked, my voice barely steady. She nodded, not noticing my panic. Little girl, maybe 4 or 5. Looked just like her mom. I left the diner that day, the locket heavy in my pocket, and told myself it was a coincidence. But now, with Clara's voice ringing in my ears, with Lily's eyes haunting me, I knew better. That night on the pier wasn't just a memory. It was the start of everything I'd lost, everything Eleanor had hidden, everything I had to find again. And as I stood there, rain-soaked and broken, I wondered if I'd ever be the man Clara had seen that night, the one who'd made the stars brighter, if only for a moment. Clara's life wasn't supposed to be like this. She hadn't dreamed of a one-room apartment with peeling wallpaper, where the hum of a flickering fluorescent bulb was the loudest thing at night. She hadn't imagined herself scrubbing tables at a greasy diner until her hands cracked, or counting coins to buy medicine for a child who deserved so much more. But here she was, 6 years after that night on the pier, living a life that felt like a betrayal of the girl she'd been, the one who'd laughed under neon lights, who believed a stranger's promise could mean something. The apartment smelled of damp and instant noodles, the only meal she could afford most days. Lily slept on a mattress in the corner, her small chest rising and falling under a threadbare blanket Clara had sewn from old shirts. Clara sat at a wobbly table, her fingers tracing the edge of a cracked mug, her eyes fixed on a small wooden box she kept hidden under a loose floorboard. Inside was the locket, its silver tarnished but still heavy with meaning, and a single photograph, the one she hadn't shown Michael at the cemetery. It was them, her and him, caught in a moment of reckless joy, their faces blurred by rain but unmistakable. She didn't look at it often. It hurt too much. She'd been 22 when she met him, fresh in the city, her heart still soft despite the bruises of a childhood spent scraping by. Her mother had been her anchor, a woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep Clara fed, who'd taught her to find light in the darkest places. "You're stronger than you know," her mother used to say, her voice rough but warm. Clara had believed her, until cancer took her mother a year before that night on the pier. That loss had left Clara unmoored, drifting in a city that didn't care if she sank. Michael had been a lifeline, even if he didn't know it, a stranger who'd seen her, really seen her, when she felt invisible. After he left, she'd waited. Days turned to weeks, then months, and the locket became a weight she carried, a reminder of a promise that never came. She'd gone back to the pier once, standing under that same awning, hoping to see him striding through the rain. He wasn't there. She told herself it didn't matter, that she'd been foolish to hope. But then she'd found out about Lily, and everything changed. The pregnancy was a shock, a secret she kept even from her closest friend, a waitress named Marta who'd let Clara crash on her couch when rent was late. "You're gonna be a great mom," Marta had said, her voice full of a certainty Clara didn't feel. But she'd tried. God, she'd tried. Lily was born in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and despair, her cries the sweetest sound Clara had ever heard. From the moment she held her daughter, Clara knew she'd do anything to give her a better life. She worked double shifts, cleaned houses on weekends, and learned to smile through exhaustion. She told Lily stories about a world full of stars, even when their own sky was blocked by smog and city lights. But every night, when Lily asked, "Where's my daddy?" Clara's heart broke a little more. She'd point to the locket, still hanging around her neck, and say, "He's out there, baby. He's just lost his way." The diner where she worked was a lifeline, though it barely paid enough to cover rent. The owner, a gruff man named Sal, let her bring Lily in on slow nights, where she'd sit in a booth, coloring on napkins. Those were the moments Clara clung to, the way Lily's laughter could drown out the clatter of dishes, the way her tiny hand fit perfectly in Clara's calloused one. But there were other moments, darker ones, when Clara would catch her reflection in the diner's window and see a woman she didn't recognize. Tired eyes, hollow cheeks, a heart that hadn't dared to hope in years. She'd never forgotten Michael, though she tried. His face haunted her, not just in her dreams but in the pages of glossy magazines, where he appeared as the untouchable Michael Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster Corporation. She'd seen him once, on a grainy TV screen in the diner, announcing a new skyscraper. His voice was the same, but colder, sharper, like the man she'd known had been carved away. She'd turned off the TV, her hands shaking, and told herself it was better this way. He'd moved on. So should she. But the locket stayed with her, a stubborn piece of the past she couldn't let go. She'd almost sold it once, when Lily needed antibiotics and the bills piled up. She'd stood in a pawn shop, the locket in her palm, but the thought of losing it, of losing him completely, had stopped her. Instead, she'd worked an extra shift, gone without dinner for a week, and kept it. It was foolish, she knew, but it was hers, a piece of a night when she'd felt alive. Then came the day she learned about Eleanor. It was Marta who told her, over coffee after a late shift. "You hear about that Lancaster guy's wife?" Marta had said, sliding a newspaper across the counter. Clara's heart stopped at the headline, "Eleanor Lancaster, philanthropist and wife of CEO, passes at 34. The photo showed a woman with sharp cheekbones and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Clara read the article, her pulse racing. Eleanor had known about her. She'd known about Lily. Marta had overheard a conversation at the diner, years ago, between Eleanor and a man Clara now realized was Michael's lawyer. "She wanted to make sure you stayed away," Marta said, her voice low. "Said you were a mistake he'd forget." Clara had gone home that night and cried, not for herself but for Lily, who'd never know the truth because of a woman who'd decided Clara wasn't worthy. She'd held her daughter close, whispering, "You're not a mistake. You're my everything." But the anger grew, a slow burn that carried her to the cemetery 2 years later, to the grave where she'd faced Michael and spoken the words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times, "This is your daughter." Now, as she sat in her apartment, the locket in her hand, Clara wondered if she'd done the right thing. Michael's face in the rain, shocked and broken, haunted her. She didn't want his money or his pity. She wanted Lily to have a father, even if it meant reopening wounds she tried to close. She closed the wooden box, hiding the locket once more, and looked at her sleeping daughter. "I'm trying, baby," she whispered. "I'm trying to make it right." But in her heart, she wasn't sure if right was even possible anymore. The city hummed with its usual indifference, a symphony of car horns and distant sirens that Clara had long since tuned out. She moved through it like a ghost, her sneakers worn thin from years of walking these streets, her arms heavy with grocery bags she'd scrounged for after a double shift at the diner. Lily skipped beside her, clutching a crayon drawing of a house with a bright yellow sun, a dream Clara couldn't afford but painted for her daughter in stories every night. It was a week since the cemetery, since she'd faced Michael and let the truth spill out like blood from an old wound. She hadn't slept well since, her dreams tangled with his shocked eyes and the weight of a locket she no longer wore. She didn't expect to see him again. Not really. Men like Michael Lancaster didn't chase ghosts, didn't linger in the messy corners of lives like hers. But fate, or whatever cruel thing passed for it, had other plans. It started with a newspaper, left on a diner table by a customer who hadn't tipped. Clara was wiping down the counter when she saw it, the headline bold and unmissable, "Lancaster Corp CEO announces charity gala for orphan children." His face stared up at her from the grainy photo, sharp jawline, eyes that seemed to see through the page. Her heart stuttered. She told herself it was nothing, just another reminder of a world she'd never belonged to. But then she saw the date and location, tomorrow night, at the Grand Meridian Hotel, where she'd been hired for a one-off catering gig to cover a coworker's shift. She almost didn't go. The thought of seeing him, of standing in his glittering world while wearing a borrowed black apron, made her stomach twist. But the pay was double her usual rate, and Lily needed new shoes, the kind that wouldn't fall apart in the rain. So she went, her hair pulled back, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. The hotel was a cathedral of glass and gold, its chandeliers casting light that made her feel small. She moved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes, her eyes fixed on the floor to avoid the gazes of the elite who laughed and clinked glasses as if money could buy absolution. And then she saw him. Michael stood across the ballroom, surrounded by suits and sequins, his presence commanding even in silence. He was different from the man on the pier, harder, colder, the lines of his face etched with a life that had no room for softness. But his eyes, when they flicked across the room, were the same. She froze, a tray wobbling in her hands, and for a moment, she thought he'd seen her. But he turned away, his attention pulled by a woman in a red dress who laughed too loudly. Clara exhaled, her pulse racing, and forced herself to keep moving. She didn't know he'd noticed her. Not at first. It was a fleeting thing, a glimpse of dark hair, a curve of a shoulder, a way of moving that tugged at a memory he couldn't place. He'd been distracted, his mind still reeling from the cemetery, from Clara's words and Lily's eyes. But as she passed by, carrying a tray to a corner table, something in him stirred. He excused himself from the conversation, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years, and followed her shadow through the crowd. He didn't know why. He just needed to see. Clara felt his gaze before she saw him. It was like a weight, pressing against her spine as she set down the tray. She turned, and there he was, closer now, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to run. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice steady, professional, a shield against the chaos inside her. He didn't answer right away, just stared, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "Do I know you?" he said finally, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the gala. Her breath caught. She wanted to scream, to throw the tray and tell him everything, how she'd waited, how she'd raised his daughter alone, how his absence had carved holes in her heart. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not here, not with Lily waiting at home and a room full of strangers watching. "I don't think so," she said, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I just work here." She turned to leave, but his hand caught her wrist, gentle but firm, and the touch sent a jolt through her, a memory of rain and neon and a night when the world felt possible. "Wait," he said, and she heard the crack in his voice, the same one she'd heard at the cemetery. "Your name. What's your name?" She pulled her wrist free, her skin burning where he'd touched her, and forced a smile that felt like a lie. "It's not important," she said, stepping back, her heart hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it. She slipped into the crowd before he could say more, her tray abandoned, her hands shaking as she pushed through a service door into the quiet of a hallway. She leaned against the wall, her breath ragged, and closed her eyes. She saw him again, not the CEO in a tailored suit, but the man who'd laughed with her in a diner, who'd written a note that made her believe in stars. She reached for the locket, forgetting she'd left it at home, and her fingers closed on empty air. "He doesn't remember," she whispered to herself, the words a bitter comfort. But he'd stopped her. He'd asked her name. And that scared her more than his indifference ever could. Back in the ballroom, Michael stood frozen, his hand still tingling from where he'd touched her. He didn't know why he'd reached out, why her face felt like a key to a lock he'd forgotten. But as he watched her disappear, a memory flickered, a woman under an awning, a cigarette glowing in the rain, a smile that had made him feel alive. He shook his head, telling himself it was impossible. Clara was gone, lost to a past he'd buried. But as he turned back to the gala, his eyes caught a glint on the floor, a small, silver hairpin, dropped in her haste. He picked it up, his fingers tracing its delicate curve, and felt a pull he couldn't explain. Across the city, Clara tucked Lily into bed, her daughter's drawing of a yellow sun now pinned to the wall. She didn't know Michael was holding that hairpin, turning it over in his hand as he sat in his empty penthouse. She didn't know he was starting to remember. But as she kissed Lily's forehead, whispering, "We're okay, baby," she felt a tremor of something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, not yet, but the ghost of it, stirring in the dark. The air in the Grand Meridian's private dining room was thick with the scent of polished wood and fresh lilies, a stark contrast to the chaos Clara carried in her chest. She stood at the edge of the room, her black apron smoothed over a borrowed dress, her hands clasped to hide their trembling. She'd been called in last minute, a favor to Sal, who'd grumbled about a VIP client needing extra staff for a lunch meeting. She hadn't expected the client to be Michael Lancaster, nor had she expected to face him again so soon after the gala, where his touch had burned her wrist and his question, "Do I know you?" had left her sleepless for days. He sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his suit impeccable, his face a mask of control as he listened to a nervous executive pitching a merger. Clara kept her eyes down, pouring water into crystal glasses, her movements mechanical. But she felt him, his presence like a current pulling her under. Every clink of glass, every rustle of paper, seemed to amplify the silence between them. She told herself to focus, to be invisible, but her heart betrayed her, thudding loud enough to drown out the executive's droning voice. Michael hadn't planned to notice her. He'd come to this meeting to escape the questions gnawing at him: Clara, Lily, the locket, the hairpin he now kept in his pocket like a talisman. But when she stepped into the room, her head bowed, her movements careful, something in him snapped awake. It wasn't just her face, though it tugged at him like a half-remembered dream. It was the way she moved, deliberate yet fragile, as if she carried a weight no one else could see. He watched her pour water, her hands steady but her knuckles white, and felt a pull he couldn't name. "Miss," he said, his voice cutting through the executive's pitch, startling everyone, including himself. Clara froze, the pitcher hovering over a glass. "Could you bring more coffee?" It was a flimsy excuse, but he needed her to look at him, to give him something to anchor the chaos in his mind. She nodded, her eyes flicking up for a fraction of a second, and he saw it again, those eyes, alive with stories, the same ones from the pier, from the cemetery. His breath caught, but she was already turning away, slipping through a side door to the kitchen. Clara leaned against the counter in the service area, her hands gripping the edge as if it could steady her. "Coffee," she muttered, forcing herself to move. She didn't want to go back in there, didn't want to face him, but she had no choice. Sal was counting on her, and Lily was counting on her, and the world didn't stop just because her heart was breaking all over again. She filled a silver pot, her reflection distorted in its curve, and took a deep breath. "You're just a waitress," she whispered. "He's just a man." When she returned, the room felt smaller, the air charged with something unspoken. She set the coffee pot on a sideboard, her back to the table, and began refilling cups. Michael watched her, his attention no longer on the merger. Her hair, pulled into a tight bun, had a single strand loose, curling against her neck. It was such a small thing, but it hit him like a memory, her hair wet from the rain, curling just like that under the pier's awning. He leaned forward, his fingers brushing the hairpin in his pocket, and spoke before he could stop himself. "Have you worked here long?" The question was absurd, out of place in a room full of executives, and Clara felt every eye turn to her. She straightened, her face a careful blank, and met his gaze for the first time. "A few years," she said, her voice steady but soft, like she was answering more than his question. His eyes narrowed, searching her face, and she saw the flicker of recognition, the same one she'd seen at the gala. Her heart raced, urging her to run, but her feet stayed rooted, trapped by the weight of his stare. Their hands brushed as she poured his coffee, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her. The pot wobbled, and he reached out, steadying it, his fingers grazing hers. "Careful," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. She pulled back, her cheeks burning, and murmured an apology. But his touch lingered, a ghost of that night 6 years ago, when his hand had been warm against hers in the rain. She wanted to hate him for forgetting, for leaving her to carry their daughter alone, but all she felt was a longing she couldn't afford. Michael's mind was a storm. Her touch, her voice, the way she said years like it carried a lifetime, it was all too familiar, too close to the woman he'd met on that pier. He thought of the locket, the note inside, the promise he'd broken. "Clara," he said, almost a whisper, testing the name. Her eyes widened, just for a moment, before she looked away, busying herself with the coffee pot. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice tighter now. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." But he hadn't. He knew it in his bones, even if his mind couldn't piece it together. The meeting dragged on, but he barely heard it, his eyes following her as she moved around the room, refilling glasses, clearing plates. She was different, thinner, wearier, her spark dimmed but not gone. He wanted to stop her, to ask her everything, but the room was a cage, and he was trapped by propriety and doubt. When she brushed past him to clear a plate, he caught a faint scent, lavender, cheap but unmistakable, the same as that night. His heart pounded, and he knew he couldn't let her leave without answers. As the meeting ended, Clara slipped out, her apron untied, her steps quick. Michael followed, ignoring the executive's puzzled looks. He caught her in the hallway, his hand gentle on her arm. "Wait," he said, his voice raw. "Please." She turned, her eyes guarded but glistening, and for a moment, they stood there, the world falling away. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, the words spilling out, an echo of something he'd said 6 years ago. Her breath hitched, and she stepped back, her hand clutching the apron like a lifeline. "I used to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And then she was gone, disappearing down the hall, leaving him with the weight of a question he wasn't ready to answer. But as he stood there, the hairpin in his pocket, her scent lingering, he knew one thing: she was Clara, and he was running out of time to make things right. The Lancaster Corp office was a fortress of glass and steel, its sterile light a far cry from the neon glow of the pier where Michael had first met Clara. He sat behind his desk, the city sprawling below, but his focus was on the hairpin in his hand, its delicate curve a tether to a past he couldn't fully grasp. Since the lunch meeting, since hearing her voice say, "I used to," his world had tilted. Clara. It had to be her. The woman from the cemetery, the woman from the gala, the woman who'd poured his coffee with hands that trembled just enough to betray her. He'd asked his assistant to find her, to track down the catering staff from the Grand Meridian. And now, she was here, standing in his office, summoned under the guise of a job offer he hadn't fully thought through. Clara stood by the door, her posture rigid, her diner uniform replaced by a simple blouse and skirt that looked borrowed. She clutched a worn purse, her eyes scanning the room, anywhere but him. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice polite but edged with something sharper, like she was bracing for a blow. He stood, gesturing to a chair, but she didn't move. The distance between them felt vast, not just the polished floor but years of silence, of promises broken and lives lived apart. "I need a temporary assistant," he said, the words sounding hollow even to him. "For a charity project. The gala raised funds for orphans, and we're organizing a follow-up event. I was told you're reliable." It was a lie, or at least a half-truth. He didn't need an assistant. He needed answers, needed to know why her face haunted him, why her daughter's eyes mirrored his own. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on her purse. "I'm not qualified," she said. "I'm just a waitress." "You're more than that," he said, too quickly, and saw her flinch. He softened his tone, stepping closer, though she stepped back, keeping the distance. "Please, sit. Let's talk." She did, reluctantly, perching on the edge of the chair like she might bolt at any moment. He sat across from her, his hands clasped to keep from reaching for the hairpin, still in his pocket. "Why did you say you used to believe in fate?" he asked, his voice low, searching. Her eyes flicked to his, then away, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It was just something to say," she replied, but her voice cracked, betraying her. She shifted, her blouse slipping slightly, revealing a thin red cord around her wrist, a bracelet, tattered but unmistakable. His breath caught. He'd tied that cord himself, 6 years ago, under a rain-soaked awning, a playful gesture after she teased him about his expensive lighter. "Only a fool would carry something so flashy in a storm," she'd said, and he'd laughed, pulling a cord from his jacket and tying it on her wrist. "Now you've got something of mine," he'd told her. "Where did you get that?" he asked, nodding to the bracelet. Her hand moved to cover it, a reflex, and her eyes darkened. "It's nothing," she said, too fast. "Just something old." But he saw the truth in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her gaze darted to the door. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Clara, please. I need to know." Her name on his lips felt like a key turning in a lock, and she stiffened, her breath hitching. "Don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't say my name like you know me." But he did know her, or at least he was starting to. The memories were there, fragmented but growing sharper, her laugh in the diner, her hand in his as they walked the pier, the locket he'd given her with a note he'd meant in the moment but hadn't understood until now. He stood, crossing to her side of the desk, and she rose too, backing toward the window, the city a blur behind her. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said, his hands raised, palms open. "But I can't stop thinking about you. About the cemetery. About Lily." Her eyes widened at her daughter's name, and for a moment, he thought she might cry. Instead, she laughed, a bitter sound that cut him. "You don't get to say her name," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't get to walk into my life after 6 years and act like you care." She turned away, her hands clenched, and he saw the bracelet again, its frayed edges a silent accusation. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the hairpin, and held it out. "You dropped this at the gala," he said. She stared at it, her expression unreadable, then took it, her fingers brushing his. The touch was electric, a spark that carried them both back to that night, to rain and neon and a world where they'd been more than strangers. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice softer now, almost breaking. "I didn't mean for any of this." He wanted to ask what she meant, to demand the truth, but something stopped him, her eyes, glistening but defiant, her shoulders squared despite the weight she carried. "Instead," he said, "I tied that bracelet on your wrist. I remember it. I remember you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the girl from the pier, the one who'd made him believe in stars. But she was different now, hardened by years he hadn't shared, by a daughter he hadn't known. "Why now?" she asked, her voice raw. "Why do you care now?" He didn't have an answer, not a good one. He could have said it was the locket, the cemetery, Lily's eyes, but those were pieces, not the whole. The truth was messier, a tangle of guilt and longing and a life that felt emptier than he'd ever admitted. "Because I can't let you walk away again," he said, and the words felt like a confession, raw and unguarded. She didn't respond, just clutched the hairpin, her bracelet a red thread tying them to a past neither could escape. The office was silent, the city's hum muted, and for a moment, they were just two people, caught in a story they hadn't finished writing. But as she turned to leave, her eyes lingering on his, he knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because the bracelet was still there, and so was the truth, waiting to break free. The office was too quiet after Clara left, the echo of her words, "Why do you care now?" lingering like a bruise. Michael sat at his desk, the hairpin and the memory of her red bracelet burning in his mind. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything but replay their conversation, her voice, the way her eyes had held both fire and fatigue. He'd seen her before, not just at the gala or the cemetery, but in fragments of a night he'd buried under ambition and Eleanor's lies. The truth was clawing its way out, and he wasn't ready for it, but he couldn't stop it either. It was his assistant, Margaret, who cracked the first layer of the mask. She'd been with Lancaster Corp for decades, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who'd seen Michael through deals and disasters. She knocked once, then entered without waiting, a habit that annoyed him but felt comforting now. "You look like hell," she said, setting a file on his desk. "What's eating you?" He didn't answer, just stared at the hairpin, its silver glinting under the desk lamp. Margaret's gaze followed his, and her expression softened, a rare thing. "That girl," she said, not a question. "The one from the catering job. She's got you twisted up." He didn't deny it. Instead, he pushed the hairpin toward her, a silent plea for something, answers, absolution, anything. Margaret picked it up, turning it over in her hands, then sighed. "You don't remember, do you?" she said, her voice low, almost pitying. "6 years ago, you came back from that trip to the coast. You were different. Quieter. I found a lighter in your office, one you never used again. And you kept asking me to check the guest lists for some event, looking for a name you couldn't quite recall." She paused, her eyes searching his. "Clara, wasn't it?" The name hit like a spark in dry grass, igniting memories he'd locked away. The lighter, silver, engraved, the one he'd given Clara to light her cigarette. He'd never replaced it, never wanted to, though he told himself it was just a thing, not a tether to a woman he'd left behind. "What else?" he asked, his voice hoarse, leaning forward. Margaret hesitated, then pulled a small envelope from her pocket, its edges yellowed with age. "I kept this," she said. "Found it in your coat after that trip. I didn't know what it meant, but I figured it was important." He took the envelope, his hands unsteady. Inside was a napkin, creased and fragile, with a sketch of a pier and 2 figures under an awning, drawn in cheap pen. Below it, in Clara's handwriting, slanted, hurried, was a single line, asterisk, "for the man who made the stars brighter." Asterisk. It was the same phrase he'd written in the locket, but seeing it in her hand, knowing she'd kept it, made his chest ache. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, though he already knew. "The pier. The diner. The night he'd promised to come back." "You were a mess after that trip," Margaret said, sitting across from him. Eleanor noticed too. "She didn't like it, you know. Kept asking me if you'd met someone. I told her no, but she wasn't convinced. She was protective, in her way. Protective." The word tasted bitter. Eleanor, his wife, who'd smiled through their marriage while hiding the truth about Clara, about Lily. He stood, pacing to the window, the city below a blur of lights and shadows. "She knew," he said, more to himself than Margaret. "She knew about Clara and kept it from me." Margaret didn't respond, but her silence was answer enough. He turned back to the napkin, tracing the sketch with his finger, and saw it all again, the rain, Clara's laugh, the way she'd looked at him like he was more than his name. He'd been reckless that night, open in a way he hadn't been since, and he'd left her with a promise he didn't keep. But Eleanor had known. She'd seen the change in him, the napkin, the lighter, and instead of asking, she'd buried it, buried Clara, buried Lily. The thought made his hands clench, the napkin crumpling in his fist. He grabbed his phone, dialing his lawyer, his voice sharp. "I need everything you have on Eleanor's personal accounts. Letters, emails, anything from 6 years ago. Now." He hung up before the man could protest, then turned to Margaret, who was watching him with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Find Clara," he said. "I don't care how. I need to talk to her." Margaret nodded, but as she stood to leave, she paused. "Be careful, Michael," she said. "Some truths don't set you free. They just break you." Alone again, he sank into his chair, the napkin spread out before him. He saw Clara's face, not just from the pier but from the office, the way she'd flinched when he said her name, the red bracelet, a silent scream of a past they'd both tried to forget. He remembered more now, her voice in the diner, soft but sure, telling him about her mother, her dreams, her fears. He'd listened, really listened, and for one night, he'd been someone who could love her. But he'd walked away, and Eleanor had made sure he never looked back. His phone buzzed, a text from his lawyer, asterisk found something. A letter Eleanor wrote but never sent. "It's about a woman named Clara, asterisk." Michael's heart stopped. He didn't need to read it to know what it would say. Eleanor had known about Clara, had known about the night that changed everything, and she'd chosen to silence it. He stood, the napkin in his hand, and felt a rage he hadn't known he could feel, not at Clara, not at himself, but at the woman he'd loved, who'd built their life on a lie. "If she's Clara," he said aloud, his voice breaking, "then I've lost more than I ever knew." He grabbed his coat, the hairpin and napkin in his pocket, and left the office, the city's lights blurring as he drove toward the diner where Clara worked. He didn't know if she'd be there, didn't know if she'd listen, but he had to try. Because the truth was out now, and it was heavier than he'd ever imagined. A daughter, a love, a life he'd been denied by the woman whose grave he'd stood over, weeping for all the wrong reasons. The diner was nearly empty, its fluorescent lights casting a sickly glow over chipped formica tables and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Clara stood behind the counter, wiping it down for the third time that night, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. She hadn't expected Michael to find her, not here, not after she'd walked out of his office with her heart in her throat. But the bell above the door chimed, and there he was, his coat damp from the drizzle outside, his face a storm of emotions she didn't want to read. She froze, the rag slipping from her hand, as he crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just short of the counter. "Clara," he said, her name a plea, a question, a confession. His eyes were wild, searching hers, and she saw the napkin in his hand, creased and worn, the sketch she'd drawn 6 years ago now a weapon in his grip. "Is this you?" he asked, his voice raw, holding up the napkin like it could answer for her. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She knew every line of that sketch, every curve of the pier she'd drawn to capture a moment she thought would last forever. Her throat tightened, and she turned away, busying herself with a stack of menus, anything to avoid his gaze. "Clara, please," he said, leaning over the counter, close enough that she could smell his cologne, sharp and expensive, a world apart from the salt and rain of their past. "I need to know. The locket, the bracelet, this napkin, did I give them to you? Were we together?" The word hung between them, fragile and heavy, and she felt her resolve crack. She wanted to lie, to send him away, to protect the life she'd built for Lily without him. But his eyes, those same eyes she saw in her daughter every day, held her captive. She turned to face him, her hands gripping the counter to keep from shaking. "You want the truth?" she said, her voice low, trembling with years of pent-up pain. "Yes, it was me. 6 years ago, on that pier, you were the man who made me believe in something bigger. You gave me the locket, tied that bracelet on my wrist, promised you'd come back. And I waited, Michael. I waited until I couldn't anymore." Her voice broke, and she hated herself for it, for letting him see her vulnerability. But she couldn't stop now. "I was pregnant when you left. I didn't know at first, but when I did, I tried to find you. I went to your office, your events, anywhere I thought you might be. But Eleanor, she made sure I'd never get close." His face paled, the napkin slipping from his hand to the counter. "Eleanor," he whispered, the name a wound. He staggered back, his hand raking through his hair, and she saw the moment it hit him, the weight of his wife's betrayal. "She knew?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her eyes glistening but her jaw set. "She found me," she said. "A month after Lily was born. She came to my apartment, offered me money to disappear. Said you'd moved on, that you didn't want a mistake like me in your life. I didn't take the money, but I believed her. I thought you'd chosen her." Michael sank onto a stool, his hands covering his face, and for a moment, she thought he might break. But when he looked up, his eyes were wet, his voice steady with a fury she hadn't expected. "She lied to me," he said. "She lied to us both. I didn't know, Clara. I swear I didn't know." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded letter, its edges worn from being handled too much. "My lawyer found this. Eleanor wrote it, never sent it. It's about you. About Lily." Clara's heart stopped. She took the letter, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. Eleanor's handwriting was elegant, precise, but the words were a confession of cruelty. "I saw the girl today, Clara. She's nothing, a fleeting distraction, but she's dangerous. She has a child, claims it's Michael's. I can't let her ruin him, ruin us. I'll make sure she stays away, for his sake. Asterisk Clara's vision blurred, tears falling onto the paper, smudging the ink. She called Lily a danger, she whispered, her voice breaking. My daughter. Your daughter. Michael stood, crossing to her side, but she stepped back, the letter crumpling in her fist. Don't, she said, her voice sharp. You don't get to be sorry now. You didn't come back. You didn't fight for me. And I raised her alone, Michael. I worked until my hands bled, lied to her about why her father wasn't there, all because you were building your empire with a woman who hated me. Her words were a flood, years of pain spilling out, and he took it, every syllable a cut he deserved. But then the bell chimed again, and a small voice broke the silence. Mommy? Lily stood in the doorway, her coat too big, her eyes wide as she clutched Marta's hand. Marta, who'd been watching Lily for the night, froze, sensing the tension. Clara's face softened, and she knelt, pulling Lily close. It's okay, baby, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. Lily looked at Michael, her gaze curious, and said, Are you the man from the graveyard? Michael's breath caught, and he knelt too, his eyes level with hers. Yeah, he said, his voice thick. I'm Michael. Lily tilted her head, then smiled, a smile so like Clara's it hurt. You look like me, she said, and Clara's sob was a quiet, broken thing. Michael reached out, hesitant, but Lily took his hand, her tiny fingers warm in his. Are you my daddy? She asked, and the question shattered him. Clara stood, pulling Lily back, her eyes on Michael, fierce and raw. I can't do this, she said, her voice a whisper. Not now. Not like this. She grabbed her purse, the letter still in her hand, and left, Lily in her arms, the bell chiming as the door swung shut. Michael didn't follow, couldn't, his legs heavy, his heart heavier. He sank to the floor, the napkin beside him, Eleanor's letter a silent accusation. I didn't know, he said to the empty diner, but the words felt hollow. Because now he did, and the truth was a wound too deep to heal. The penthouse was a mausoleum of glass and silence, its sleek surfaces reflecting nothing but Michael's own hollowed face. He sat on the edge of a leather couch, the city's light sprawling below, indifferent to the wreckage inside him. The napkin from the diner lay on the coffee table, its sketch of the pier now a map of his failures. Beside it, Eleanor's letter, creased and accusing, and the locket, open to reveal the note he'd written 6 years ago, asterisk, for the one who makes the stars brighter. Asterisk he hadn't touched a drink, hadn't turned on a light. The dark felt right, a mirror to the emptiness that had settled in his chest since Clara walked out of the diner, Lily's question, Are you my daddy? Echoing like a verdict. He'd been a fool, he saw that now. Not just for leaving Clara, for breaking a promise he'd meant in the moment, but for trusting Eleanor, for building a life on her lies. He'd loved her, or thought he had, but love shouldn't feel like a cage, shouldn't hide a daughter, a family, a truth that could have changed everything. He closed his eyes, and Clara's face came to him, not the weary woman in the diner, but the girl on the pier, her laugh cutting through the rain, her eyes daring him to be more than his name. He'd failed her then, and he was failing her now, sitting here while she carried their daughter alone. Lily. The name was a blade, sharp and small, cutting deeper with every thought. He saw her eyes, his eyes, bright and curious, asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. He'd held her hand for a moment, felt the weight of her trust, and it had undone him. He wasn't a father, didn't know how to be, but the thought of her growing up without him, believing he'd chosen to stay away, was unbearable. He stood, pacing the room, his hands raking through his hair. He'd built an empire, commanded boardrooms, but none of it mattered if he couldn't face this, couldn't make it right. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through missed calls, his lawyer, his assistant, investors who didn't matter now. He dialed Clara's number, the one Margaret had found in the catering records, but it went to voicemail, her voice clipped and professional. This is Clara. Leave a message. He tried again, then again, each unanswered call a stone in his gut. "Clara," he said finally, his voice breaking into the void of the recording. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I need to see you, to see Lily. Please." He hung up, the words feeling too small, too late. He went to the diner the next morning, hoping she'd be there, but the counter was manned by Marta, who eyed him with a mix of pity and suspicion. "She's not here," Marta said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Took a few days off. Don't know where she went." Michael's heart sank, but he pressed on. "Do you know where she lives?" Marta's eyes narrowed, protective, and he softened his tone. "Please. I need to talk to her. It's about her daughter." Marta hesitated, then scribbled an address on a napkin, sliding it across the counter. "Don't hurt her," she said. "She's been through enough." The address led to a crumbling apartment building, its halls smelling of mildew and regret. He knocked on Clara's door, his heart pounding, but no one answered. A neighbor, an older woman with a cigarette dangling from her lips, leaned out. "They're gone," she said, eyeing his suit. "Left yesterday. Didn't say where." Michael's knees weakened, and he leaned against the wall, the napkin with the address crumpling in his hand. Gone. He'd driven her away, just like he had 6 years ago, and the weight of it was crushing. He drove to every place he could think of, the diner, the pier, the hotel where the gala had been. He asked strangers, showed them the napkin sketch, described Clara's face, Lily's curls, but no one knew them. The city, so vast, had swallowed them, and he was left with nothing but memories and regrets. He ended up at the cemetery, standing before Eleanor's grave, the locket in his hand. "Why?" he asked the silent stone, his voice raw. "Why did you keep them from me?" But Eleanor couldn't answer, and the truth was, he'd let her lie. He'd chosen her, chosen the life she offered, and turned his back on the woman who'd seen him as more than a name. He sank to the ground, the grass damp beneath him, and opened the locket again. The photo inside, him and Clara, blurred by rain, was a lifeline, a reminder of who he'd been before ambition hardened him. He thought of Lily's drawing, the one Marta had mentioned, a house with a yellow sun. Clara had given her daughter dreams, even when she had nothing else, and Michael had given her nothing but absence. "I was wrong," he said aloud, to the grave, to the locket, to himself. "I was wrong about everything." He stood, the locket clutched in his fist, and made a decision. He'd find them, no matter how long it took. He'd sell the penthouse, step back from the company, do whatever it took to prove he wasn't the man who'd walked away. He drove back to the city, stopping at a small bakery he remembered Clara mentioning, one that sold cherry pie. The owner, a kind-eyed woman, listened as he explained, his voice thick with desperation. "Clara," she said, nodding. "She used to come here with her little girl. Left a note for someone, said she'd be back for it." She handed him a folded piece of paper, Clara's handwriting unmistakable, asterisk, "I'm not running because I hate you. I'm running because I can't hope anymore." Asterisk. Michael's heart broke, but it also sparked. She wasn't gone forever. She'd be back. And when she was, he'd be there, not as the CEO, not as the man who'd failed her, but as someone who could learn to be a father, a partner, a man worthy of the stars she'd once seen in him. He slipped the note into his pocket, next to the locket, and walked into the rain, determined to wait, to fight, to make things right, even if it took the rest of his life. The park was quiet, bathed in the soft gold of late afternoon, its paths lined with trees that whispered in the breeze. Michael stood by a wooden bench, his coat draped over his arm, the locket a familiar weight in his pocket. He'd been coming here for weeks, ever since the bakery owner had slipped him Clara's note, ever since he'd decided to stop running from the man he'd been. The city moved around him, children laughing, joggers passing, couples sharing quiet moments, but he was still, his eyes scanning every face, every figure, for her. For them. Clara and Lily, the family he'd lost before he'd known they were his. He'd changed in those weeks. The penthouse was sold, its proceeds funneled into a foundation for single mothers, a quiet tribute to Clara's strength. He'd stepped back from Lancaster Corp, leaving it to executives who didn't need his shadow looming over them. He'd kept the locket, the napkin, the hairpin, carrying them like relics of a life he was determined to reclaim. He'd visited the pier, the diner, the places where Clara's presence lingered, hoping for a sign. The bakery owner had been his only lead, her words a lifeline. Clara comes back sometimes, for cherry pie. She'll be here. So he waited, not as the CEO, but as a man who'd learned, too late, what mattered. Today felt different. The air was lighter, the sky clearer, and when he saw her, his heart knew before his eyes did. Clara sat on a bench across the park, her hair loose, a book open on her lap as Lily played nearby, chasing a butterfly with a giggle that carried on the wind. Michael didn't move at first, afraid to break the moment, afraid she'd vanish again. She looked tired but softer, the edges of her grief smoothed by time or resolve. Lily's curls bounced as she ran, her dress a bright splash of blue against the green grass, and Michael's throat tightened. She was his daughter, and he'd missed so much already. He watched from a distance, his hands clenched, the locket warm in his palm. Clara glanced up, her eyes catching Lily's joy, and for a moment, she smiled, a smile that took him back to the pier, to neon lights and rain. He wanted to go to her, to kneel and beg for forgiveness, but he stayed rooted, letting her have this peace. Then Lily tripped, a small stumble that sent her sprawling onto the grass, and Michael moved before he could think, crossing the park in quick strides. He reached her as she sat up, her lip trembling but her eyes dry. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked, kneeling beside her, his voice gentle. Lily looked at him, her gaze curious, and nodded. "I'm tough," she said, brushing dirt from her hands, and he laughed, a sound that felt foreign but right. "I bet you are," he said, helping her stand. She tilted her head, studying him, and his heart stopped when she said, "You're the man from the diner. The one who looks like me." Clara was there before he could answer, her book forgotten, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something softer. "Lily, come here," she said, her voice steady but strained. Lily obeyed, clutching her mother's hand, but her eyes stayed on Michael, bright and searching. He stood, his hands open, palms up, a gesture of surrender. "Clara," he said, her name a prayer. "I didn't come to hurt you. I needed to see you. Both of you." She didn't speak, just held Lily close, her gaze locked on his. The park faded, the trees, the laughter, the breeze, until it was just them, standing in the wreckage of 6 years. He saw the red bracelet on her wrist, frayed but still there, and his chest ached. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low, raw. "I was wrong to leave you, to let Eleanor's lies keep us apart. I didn't know about Lily, about you, but that's no excuse. I should have fought for you. I should have come back." Clara's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "You didn't know," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I did. I carried her, raised her, loved her, while you built a life I could never touch. And I don't know if I can trust you now, Michael. Not after everything." Her words cut, but they were honest, and he welcomed the pain. He deserved it. He took a step closer, careful, like approaching a wounded animal. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said. "I haven't earned it. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Not this time." Lily tugged at Clara's hand, her voice small but clear. "Is he my daddy, Mommy?" Clara's breath hitched, and Michael saw the war in her eyes, fear, hope, love, all tangled together. She knelt, brushing a curl from Lily's face, and nodded. "Yeah, baby," she said, her voice breaking. "He is." Lily looked at Michael, her smile tentative but real, and he felt something shift, a weight lifting even as another settled in its place. He knelt again, level with Lily, and pulled the locket from his pocket. This was your mom's, he said, opening it to show the photo, the note. I gave it to her a long time ago, when I was someone who believed in promises. I'm trying to be that man again. Lily touched the locket, her fingers delicate, and Clara watched, her hand covering her mouth, tears spilling silently. Clara stood, Lily still holding her hand, and stepped closer to Michael. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her free hand reached out, hesitating, then rested on his, a touch so light it was almost a question. He closed his fingers around hers, careful not to hold too tight, and felt the world steady. I don't know what this means, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if we can fix this. But Lily deserves to know you. And maybe I need to know you too. He nodded, his throat too tight for words, and they stood there, hands linked, Lily between them, the park alive around them. The locket gleamed in the sunlight, its promise no longer a weight but a bridge, fragile but real. They didn't speak of love, of futures, of forgiveness, not yet.